This video is dedicated to Christian Roberts. Christian, thank you. Hello all, tribalkai here. Going to be showing you how to make a commander deck today, or showing you my process of making commander decks. I was asked, before Christmas I think it was, how I make commander decks, and I've been meaning to get round to it for the past few months, and it's made it to February, and I figure might as well get it done before the Kamigawa set releases. So let's go through the process of exactly how I do that. So the first thing we want to decide ultimately is what is the tactic of the deck? What is it exactly that we want the deck to do? So I assume that you found a commander that you want to build around, or a card that you want to build an entire deck around. And what a lot of people will do is just start slamming a load of cards in and looking online and cherry picking bits of cards that they like and just shoving it all into a deck. And that's fine, and you can make a okay to decent deck out of that. But it's not conducive to making a consistent deck that ought to do what exactly you were hoping it would do, with any kind of regularity. I'm talking from experience here, and lots of times I've seen other people do it, and I've done it myself, where you just want to play the commander and then you think it'll kind of build itself, and ultimately it doesn't. And if you build a deck with no particular goal in mind, then you can't make any kind of educated guesses on what would do well in the slots that you put the cards into. So first and foremost is you want to find a tactic around the card, the commander, the series of cards that you want to build the deck around, and then keep that in mind throughout the entire build. That is of the utmost importance when building a deck. What do you want it to do? That is typically the easiest part of the deck building process, is finding out what you actually want to build and how you want it to work. But it does dictate the types of ramp that you can put in the deck, the types of synergies, the types of card draw, etc. and so forth, removal. So with that in mind, we can go over to the next section. Now, what I've got into the habit of doing more recently is filling roughly half the deck with mana. So that is about 35 to 37 lands nowadays, typically speaking. There are decks where I'll run 38, 40, maybe even over 40 lands. They tend to be the really rampy, heavy land decks though, and lands matter and stuff like that. So typically speaking, 35 to 37 lands nowadays. There was a time when I wouldn't have said to go below 37, but as we'll see later, the curves are getting much lower now. So yeah, around that many lands, and then make up the rest of the deck up to 50 with different ramp spells. So your Rampant Growths and Arcane Signets, Soul Rings, stuff like that. If you can go for land-based ramp over Mana Rocks, Artifacts and stuff like that, Mana Dorks, then that's going to be much more likely to survive for you. It's way more difficult to get rid of lands than it is Arcane Signets and things like that. Certainly very easy to get rid of Llanowar Elves in board wipes and stuff, and then you're down a bunch of mana. So if you're in green or some other decks, then you can go for the land-based ramp over anything else. But 50%, around 50 of your cards in your deck should be lands and ramp. Now, which ramp pieces you choose depends on the colours, it depends on the archetype of the deck. So for instance, I was just talking about Mana Dorks. Mana Dorks are okay in an elf deck, for instance, because you're killing two birds with one stone there. You are running elf tribal, so you've got elf creatures. So you could get triggers on having elves in play, or maybe in the late game they can just swing in with a bunch of other elves, but they can also ramp you in the early game. So there's little bits of crossover there where you're upping your creature count in this instance and your number of creatures of a certain tribe, but you're also ramping at the same time. So some cards can fill two different roles, and that is the role of synergy also. So that's where synergy comes into play. But before we get fully into synergy, let's go over to the next point. The next point for me being card advantage. Now, I try to aim for card advantage to be at around the 10 mark, around 10 cards. But there's different forms of card advantage, right? You could get a bunch of cards out of your graveyard, especially if you're into self-mill or a reanimator deck or something like that. You could gain card draw in that way. Typical card advantage is just drawing cards off the top of your library, though, of course. So Typically speaking, you will want to be drawing cards as your card advantage, as opposed to using things like Eternal Witness and other means of grabbing a load of stuff out of the bin. Rise of the Dark Realms, stuff like that, could be seen as card advantage. And once again, same as the ramp, and I'll keep using Lathril as an example just so that we've got something to go off. You can use the Elves in this instance as card advantage as well. So say there's a card that says whenever I cast an elf I draw a card, something like that, or even whenever I cast an elf I get an elf token, so that would be some kind of card advantage. I'm getting a token out of nothing effectively. You want to keep cards in your hand, but that type of effect from Lisolana Huntmaster I think does that. That will be some semblance of card advantage as well. It's not necessarily as good as card draw, but it will help you litter the board and get all those elves into play like you want to do in an elf deck. So lots of different types of card advantage. It's not just about drawing cards, and the more of it you can cram into the deck and the more of it you can synergize with the rest of your deck, you're constantly killing two birds with one stone. So you really have to kind of do your research and your homework in order to see what works with what. And a lot of that comes from play testing as well. And then it's interaction and answers as well. So interaction being, removal spells, counter magic, bouncing all your opponent's stuff back and trying to keep them from doing what they want to do to you. All that kind of thing. You know what interaction is. And typically 10 to 15 pieces. I'm pretty removal heavy in my decks, typically speaking. It ultimately depends on what I want to do with the deck. If I'm building it as a more casual deck and I don't want to annoy my opponents, then I won't put as much in. But typically speaking, I run a lot of spot removal. I'm not a huge fan of lots of board wipes in a game because it just makes me roll my eyes into the back of my head. Board wipes, people recommend as high as 5. I put 2 to 3 in my deck because I don't mind losing for the sake of not getting that 5th board wipe off out of my deck. I'd rather lose than and get another game going than dragging a game to a halt and making it last 4 hours. So personally speaking, board wipes for me is around the 3 mark, but people will recommend higher than that. I would rather see spot removal and getting rid of problem permanents and everyone still being able to play the game instead of rebuilding their entire board for the 6th time. So things like Assassin's Trophy, Beast Within, Counterspell. You all know the different pieces of interaction that can go in any colour combination. And once again, we're going to talk about that synergy again. So like I said, I'll keep going back to Lathril and the elf decks. If there's an elf that comes into play, such as Reclamation Sage, then that comes into play. It destroys an artifact or enchantment. You are not only getting yourself a cast trigger on a creature, which could do something for you, you're getting a body into play. The body type is relevant in an elf in this instance, and you're blowing up one of your opponent's creatures. So once again, killing lots of birds with one stone there, all for the sake of 3 mana or for the sake of casting a creature. So as much of that as you can ram into the deck as possible. And some decks and archetypes are more synergistic than others, but the more you can do that and get multiple effects, for lack of a better term, out of one spell, i.e. getting all the synergies in there, as well as the actual effect of blowing something up, the more you can do that, then the better your deck's going to run. And then if you want to, you can run some tutors as well. Some people frown upon tutors. I've run less and less tutors. I only tend to run the fast tutors, so Worldly Tutor, Mystical Tutor, and Vampiric Tutor. I don't necessarily tend to run those as much nowadays, but if I feel as though a deck warrants it, then I will run those. Every black deck that I make runs Demonic Tutor because it's just another copy of every card in your deck, and for only 2 mana, it's too good not to run it. Green has like Chord of Calling, Green Sun Zenith, and stuff like that. That's really good. Blue has Artifact tutors that go straight onto the board, so those are really good. White can get some enchantments, Idyllic Tutor, might be worth running. But ultimately, I would typically only run, personally myself, around 2 tutors. It really does depend on if you really want the deck to be as spiky as possible and always win, then you would go for like 5 tutors and always get those combo pieces consistently and stuff like that. That's pretty boring to me. It makes your deck way too consistent and way too like one track, you know? It always does the same thing. We ultimately want our decks to do a similar thing every time, hence the consistency, but I don't want it to just be totally like, right, okay, this deck plays itself, I get the tutor, I go for that piece, and it just gets boring really quickly to me. So I only tend to run like 2, maybe 3 tutors, but people will probably recommend more than that to you, so ultimately up to you, of course, because it's your deck. And that means that the rest of the slots, you should have around 25, 30 cards left, something like that, goes into the actual fun bit, the running of the deck itself. So people think when they're making a deck, like, oh, it's a 100 card deck, I'll have plenty of room to do the things that I want to do. In actual fact, when all is said and done, it's only really 30, maybe 40 at a push cards that are actually going to be different and interesting. So it's once again back where the synergy comes into play, where you want to have multiple cards fill multiple slots if you can. So the elf comes down, it draws you a bunch of cards. The elf comes down, it blows something up. The elf comes down, it allows you to tutor, or it's part of a combo piece or something like that. So really keeping in mind the strategy of the deck that we went over right at the beginning, you've really got to keep that in mind with every single card that you decide to choose. And then the synergies as well is something that should always be in mind also. Now, it's all well and good saying, oh, well, just add a bunch of cards to your deck and that's you done. We know the numbers that we should be going for, roughly speaking, but how do you know which cards to add to a deck for any type of specific strategy? Well, what I will do typically is I'll look online, I'll look on YouTube for deck techs online with TapTow or Moxfield or whatever site you use. I'll just Google it and then see the different types of cards people are using, the different types of tactics they're going for, see if I like the look of the curve and the look of the individual cards that they're using, stuff like that. Maybe they're going for a certain type of combo or something, and I think that I could implement that in my deck. Then that is certainly something that you could go for and pilfer ideas from other people, basically. Another source that you could go to is a website called EDH Rec, and this is a gold mine. The veteran players will already know about this, I imagine, but the newer players might not. And basically, here we are in EDH Rec, and it's a website that grabs all the most relevant and all the most commonly used individual cards for a commander. So it sprawls across all the different deck lists on the internet and then throws them up on this page and will give you a list of cards that you should consider adding, basically. So if we go down here, a list of new cards from one of the newest sets will appear here, and then the high synergy cards are ones that you should be looking at as well. So if you troll through all the decks online and probably talk to your friends about their decks as well, they're probably in their elf decks adding Elvish Archdruid, Lysolana Huntmaster, we already mentioned, a good card advantage card. Beast Whisperer is more card advantage as well, so basically you would just scroll through all this and you would cherry pick the cards that you think are best for your deck that you're trying to build with your strategy in mind. Very important that we keep that strategy in mind, don't forget, because you could scroll through this and add a bunch of cards that are irrelevant to you. Just because everyone else is running them doesn't mean you necessarily should. And you can do this for any commander, of course, so I brought up Damia, Sage of Stone here. But the one thing that I wanted to show you was you can do it by theme here. So drop-down menu appears. And maybe you don't just want to build your generic Damia list, maybe you want to build a Lands Matter deck or a Death Touch deck. So we click on Death Touch and that will change all the cards that it suggests for us. So in a typical Damia list, I dare say you wouldn't run Hooded Blightfang, but in a Death Touch deck, you would certainly look at building that, or building that into your deck, along with all these cards that it is suggesting here. So this is Death Touch Tribal, basically. So you could look for some kind of sub-theme within a commander and see which cards it throws up at you for that. see if you can come up with any better ideas for your deck that you can implement. So sticking with the easy example of Lathril, we are in my Lathril deck on Magic Online here. Chosen Lathril because it's Elves and it's just easy to understand what Elves is all about. It's throw out a bunch of Elves, make a bunch of mana, go wide on your opponents by generating too many tokens, buffing them up really big. It's typical Elf/Goblin type strategy, so an easy example to use here. And yeah, so we can see here that I have only 34 lands in the deck. The curve is pretty low and we've got lots and lots of mana dorks like the classic Llanowar Elves, so didn't feel the need to have as many lands. I think I actually started this with 36 lands and then dropped it by a couple upon testing the deck, which is just something that you have to do with your new decks and hope that you can tweak them to a point where you're happy with them. I've included in this pile some of the untapped stuff. So you could argue that they are not ramps, so if we just put those to one side for a minute, you can see here that we've got roughly 50 cards, 34 lands and 15 ramp spells, so there's a few rocks in Mana Crypt, Sol Ring and Arcane Signet, but we've got the dorks as well, like I said, Elves of Deep Shadow, the Heritage Druid, all creatures that tap for mana. Typically speaking, I would not go for a bunch of dorks, but herein lies the synergy with elf decks. They generate mana in the early game, and then they are potentially big elves that can swing in the late game, so don't necessarily mind running these specifically in an elf deck, but typically speaking I would be running in a green deck land-based ramp like Farseek and 3 Visits and Nature's Law, Cultivate, things like that. And in decks where you can't go for land-based ramp, you would go for rocks, so you know, your Arcane Signets, Mind Stones, Gilded Lotus, things like that. But like I said, we're going for the synergy here in an elf tribal deck, so if we can get elves into play and generate mana at the same time, then that is obviously really good for us. There is a little bit of land-based ramp here. We've got the Wood Elves that gets a land. Farhaven Elf does it as well. And then, as you all know, there are elves that generate a ton of mana, so pretty much 50 of the cards in the deck are mana. And then it's on to the card draw here. I actually have 11 card draw spells, so I recommend roughly 10, but I'm sure that some of them have multiple reasons to be in the deck. So Skull Clamp, clamp tokens and draw cards. But then we've also got some elves in here as well, of course, with it being an elf tribal deck. So Skenfar Avenger is both an elf and card draw. So once again, seeing that synergy. The same can be said of the Beast Whisperer. And then we want to be getting into the red zone attacking in an elf deck. So I've got some card draw that relies on getting into the red zone, hitting your opponent. So Hunter's Insight and Toski. There's Aurum Frostfang as well. That goes along with our tactic of the deck. We want to make lots of tokens, turning sideways and hit our opponent. So obviously those strategies go hand in hand with that. You wouldn't go for something like that if you weren't looking for going in for attacks, because you're never going to attack and get the benefit of it. So things to bear in mind. Return of the Wild Speaker, 2 birds with 1 stone again. So we want an overrun effect there. All of our creatures are non-humans, so we get the overrun effect to try and deal lethal damage to our opponent, as well as potentially draw a bunch of cards. Shamanic Revelation, bunch of creatures in play, draw cards per creature we've got. So you get the idea. Trying not to have this turn into a Lathril deck tech video. I'm just trying to give you my reasoning for picking the specific cards and then trying to hammer home that synergy. Got some more cards here. This is a little bit of a card advantage pile as well, but it's in a different form. So Wolverine Riders, Elven Ambush, Elven Warmaster or Elvish Warmaster. They're elves, once again, and they can generate tokens. So generating tokens out of nothing is card advantage. It's not your typical card advantage in the form of card draw, but you are getting card advantage because you're making creatures out of nothing effectively for no mana. And then you can reanimate a bunch of stuff as well in tribal decks. So Patriarch's Bidding, Haunting Voyage, and Agadeem's Awakening. Actually 35 lands in this deck because this is a land as well. So that is just perfect example of synergy. It is a land when you need it to be. If you don't need it to be, use it as card advantage to reanimate a bunch of creatures that have died because you're in the late game. Same with Elvish Warmaster, we've got that overrun effect, and it can generate tokens as well as being an elf itself. So you see what I mean with having multiple cards, or individual cards I should say, doing multiple things for you. You want to cram as much of that type of thing in as possible. So we've got the roughly 50 mana cards there, roughly 10 card draw spells, and then with a little bit of other card advantage and synergy with some reanimation stuff here. You can go for Eternal Witnesses and things that fish sorceries out of the graveyard and stuff like that. Put a little bit of that in there just to make use of your spells again. And then we're over to removal again, running light on removal here, so arguably going against my own advice here. I say to run as close to 10 removal spells as you can, spot removal I'm talking about, and then I personally run roughly 3 board wipes, but people say like 5 or 6 board wipes. I consider that a bit try hard, but I've got 3 board wipes in here. Toxic Deluge, Elvish Dreadlord, arguably don't count that as a board wipe, but it is an elf, so there's that synergy again. And then Kindred Dominance. So in a creature-based deck, we don't want to be wiping the board very much because we've got our creatures in play and we want to be swinging in with them. Can't swing in with them if they've all been blown up. So a tactical-based board wipe like this, a one-sided board wipe as much as you can use them, so it doesn't affect your board, it affects your opponent's. That will be really useful for you. So yeah, just little things to think about here. And as for the spot removal, it is, as you guessed, elf-based for the most part. So we can blow things up there with the elves that we play. Once again, synergy. I'll say it until I'm blue in the face, apparently. But typically speaking, you would have roughly 10 spot removal spells and then 3 to 5 board wipes. I've completely broken that rule here because I wanted to go all in on the elf strategy and just be piling on the elves constantly and really overwhelm my opponents. So not all the rules, quote unquote, that I bring to you here are going to be absolutely ironclad and you have to go for them. But they are something worth bearing in mind. And then one thing that I didn't bring up previously was sub-themes. So a lot of the times in your decks you can introduce a sub-theme strictly if it complements the theme you've already got. So the very first thing I said to you was you have to pick a theme and you've got to pick a tactic that you want to build your entire deck around. And it might be that you want to throw in a few pet cards here and there, and you can do that if you want to, but it will ultimately, typically speaking, it will ultimately reduce the consistency and the success rate of your deck. So if that's something that you're bothered about, then you need to kind of let go of the pet cards sometimes. But if your sub-theme can benefit and go hand in hand with your main theme, which it can here, then you can throw in, I don't think I'd go more than 5 cards in a sub-theme. Typically speaking, I just kind of don't like drawing into them. I would only put 3 to 5 sub-theme cards in personally. Here it is an aristocrat sub-theme and a draining your opponent's life per elf you have kind of thing, or per deaths your elves receive kind of thing. So we see the Skemfar Shadow Sage, the Elderfang Venom, so difficult to remove as part of a board wipe. So if you can consistently rebuild your elves over and over again and force them to blow them all up, they're still going to be receiving damage, so hence the sub-theme. And yeah, we've got 4 of those cards in this deck, so 3 of which are actually elves, so we've allowed ourselves to do that here. Only got 1 tutor in the deck. I said that you should run 2 to 5 tutors, I think. I typically only run 2, maybe 3 at a push, because I'd rather just draw into the cards as opposed to searching for them. I don't want my decks to be too consistent, otherwise it's like they're on tracks and playing themselves. So only 1 demonic tutor in here. And the rest is just support cards for the main part. So in this deck I would want to get Lathril into play and hit my opponent for a lot of damage to make a lot of tokens. But but just as a 2/3 menace, not entirely likely that it's going to do that all by itself. So have cards like Wirewood Pride, so that I could potentially put that on my creature before attacking, make it less likely that they'll want to block if they don't have any chump blockers. Things like Trailblazer's Boots to effectively make it unblockable. Really bearing in mind what I want to be doing during the game. Fallen Ideal gives it flying, so I can get straight in at my opponents. Timberwatch Elf buffs it a bunch. There's another one here called Elves Champion, makes it unblockable, so it's not only a support card, but it makes it unblockable, buffs all the other elves as well, is an elf itself. You get the idea at this point. And then protecting the commander or the individual creatures as well, so your typical Swiftfoot Boots, Lightning Greaves, so they don't necessarily go in any particular area. You could, I suppose, make another section for your deck that is all about support cards and making sure that your deck runs smoothly, in which you would put Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves and things like Heroic Intervention. We want our board intact, so need a support card like Heroic Intervention. But you get the rough idea. If you keep those tactics in mind of 50 pieces of mana, 10 card draw spells, roughly as close to, I'd say 5 to 10 spot removal cards. I try to get as close to 10 as possible. Around 3 to 5 board wipes, and then the rest of your deck being the deck itself, if you like, and that would include the support cards as well, so maybe throw in 5 support cards or something like that. You could say 5 spot removal cards, 5 support cards, just to make the maths easy. And then you've got yourselves a rough strategy of how to build the deck. Now, just to throw the spanner into the works even further, if we sort the deck by mana base here, or by mana value, this is referred to as the mana curve. So you will go on deck building websites where you upload your decks, and it'll show you it in the form of a bar chart, which is effectively this. So you typically want your decks to peak at either 2 mana or 3 mana. In years gone by, I always had my decks peaking at 3 mana. But as more and more powerful cards have been printed, more and more power creep has come into the game, cheaper and cheaper cards have been introduced with that, and the format's gotten faster and faster and faster, and so the vast majority of my decks actually peak at 2 mana now. It depends on who you ask. Like, I know PJ from Commander Replay, he plays a lot of heavier cards in the 4, 5, 6 mana slots, because I think his games tend to be much more board wipe intensive, and people trying a bit harder to win. I would personally rather play games where people are obviously trying to win and they're trying to get their tactics going, but I'd rather see less board wipes if it's up to me. And I do tend to see less board wipes on Magic Online playing against randoms. I see less board wipes against my paper friends as well, and I'd rather lose and see less board wipes than sit through a game where there's 6 board wipes every game. That would get very draining to me. But if you are in a meta with lots of board wipes, then you do what PJ does, and you have bigger bombs in the late game, so that you can slam one card down and it has a huge impact, as opposed to lots of little cards having lots of little impact amounting to a big amount of impact. You know what I mean? That's the tactic I tend to go for, but it ultimately depends on your meta. So I tend to peak at 2 mana nowadays. You could push to 3 mana, that's fine as well. But you definitely want to be keeping your mana curve in line. Again, typically speaking, I wouldn't have this many cards in the 1-drop slot. It's just because there's lots of elves at 1 mana that generate mana. I would typically only have, 4, 5 cards in the 1-drop slot, and then not too many in the 6+ slots either. So most of your very powerful spells will be in the 4 to 5 slot if it's up to me. But once again, it's so meta dependent and so dependent on the deck itself that you're building. For instance, with a Reanimator deck, you will have cards over here that you never plan on casting because you're going to reanimate them, so you would want to tutor them or loot them into the bin and then reanimate them, but that puts your mana curve off a little bit, so you just have to play with that in mind. But with all that being said, I think I've rambled on long enough now. I hope that you all find this useful. I've been meaning to make this video for a long time, so hopefully you found it useful. Be sure to leave it a thumbs up and subscribe if you did. I'm tribalkai on the EDH channel. Thank you for watching.